Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Cultural Anthropology, and we're talking about art and media. Let's continue with our discussion. So, we're talking about aesthetics and logic. And I think it's important to kind of look at um, sort of the idea of logic when it comes to art, because it can either be exceptionally logical or it can challenge our very concept of logic and what makes sense. And that's, I think, one of the important things to try and understand about art, who creates that art, and then where that fits into sort of their societies or their culture's understanding of those concepts, right? For example, right, when I think about things like science fiction, okay, science fiction as an art form, oftentimes takes um, a stance on the future, right? What's going to happen in the future? Science fiction is usually a futuristic uh, medium, right? Looking at what could possibly happen. And in that, in a lot of science fiction, we see usually a state of some sort of decay, something that is happening to the world and it's bad and but we have a possibility for the future, right? There's something that could happen that's going to be good, but we just have to put enough effort into it. And we see that in some of the greatest representations of science fiction in general, things like Star Trek, right? Star Trek is all about the future of humanity, but humanity had to have a third world war before it could get to prosperity, right? And it still deals with all of those issues that humanity and possibly um, all of its different representations of alienness and all the difficulties that we might face. And that is a common theme throughout science fiction. If you look at science fiction compared to, say, the United States and those that created it, they're taking real world issues and making comparisons and then thinking about the possibilities for solution or for whatever happens next, right? But it is usually commentary about what's happening within that community at that time. So we can see sort of like this again, how logic can be stretched and be seen in different ways when it comes to that creation of art. Um, it can get us to challenge beyond what we consider to be normal. Um, Different perception. I think of like Picasso, um, or thinking about music like jazz, right? Sometimes when I listen to jazz and it's like Thelonious Monk, like that guy drives me nuts. I can certainly appreciate the music that he creates, but it is all over the place, and it challenges me to be able to listen to that music because it pushes me outside of the norm of what I generally appreciate about um, more popular music. Um, more mainstream music. So yeah, it can be challenging. It can push us outside of our norm, or outside of our comfort zone, especially when we are presented with ideas or concepts that are foreign to our sense of individuality or to our national identity. It can become a symbol representing something else, or it can be unique in its origin. Um, and this is right. All art is symbolic of something, some sort of an idea, some sort of a concept, uh, an emotional response, a political response. Right. All art is symbolic of something, some sort of expression. Um, but is it something that is shared by everyone? Is it like an emotional response to a song? or is it unique, and so that the person that created it only truly knows what it means and what it represents, and that other people aren't going to appreciate necessarily that concept. So how it gets experienced um, can vary depending on sort of the objective of that creator. Um, Culture determines what we consider to be beautiful, right? And this is important to understand that all of our concepts, everything that we find beautiful and tasteful and enjoyable, it's all stuff that is connected to our sense of beauty. And that beauty changes over time. It depends on the circumstances of that culture and the cultural influences that are both coming into and are leaving that community. But then we come across this concept of universal art. And this is certainly something that's really important to understand how universal art has influenced Western society in general, but that it is also quite wrong in its sort of ideology. So we had philosophers Immanuel Kant and George Hegel who believed in this concept of the universal gaze, right? And that all humans share this universal gaze. And it's become a very popular idea in which, um, certainly within Western society, that we have developed a lot of our art museums and art galleries um, as these places where we experience art and how that art is eventually experienced. So if you go to like an art gallery, oftentimes they're big open spaces where you can sort of focus on a piece of art that's hanging on a wall or sitting on a pedestal, and you can look at it and you can experience it for yourself because there's usually very little information on that piece of art, right? And it's oftentimes within the Western gaze this idea that art is to be experienced by the individual, and they are supposed to get something unique out of it without telling a story behind it. And there might be a very interesting story behind the creation of that art. Um, but that universal gaze is oftentimes really trying to focus on that consumption of art in a very particular way. Um, it's oftentimes a very minimalist approach. Again, not having a lot of distraction from the experience of that artwork. Um, and this has sort of become the norm of what art should be, this universal gaze that everyone appreciates the same thing as well, right? Universal art means that everyone's going to enjoy that art, right? Doesn't matter what culture you come from, but just the human experience is going to say that you are going to appreciate this style of art. And that's not necessarily the case because as we go around the world, we find different artistic expression that isn't always enjoyable by everyone that gets to experience it. Um, so, and that universal art coming from that Western gaze and experience um, uh, has a legacy that's attached to it, right? Has that European legacy and eventually American legacy that influences the value of that art. And then that art gets shared around the world and is expected to be experienced in the same way. And then also treats different types of art in different kinds of way. Oftentimes, universal art treats art for art's sake, right? You're an artist and you create art so that you are an artist, right? Not necessarily looking for the practical reasons why you might create art, um, but for just the pureness of creating, writing a piece of music. Um, it was always interesting to see sort of the value, especially if we go back in time to the 50s and 60s. You had these guys that were songwriters. They wrote jingles, right? A jingle being for like a commercial, a little song, a little music that would get into your head um, and would stay there. Uh, but it wasn't a full song. It wasn't something. It was for a 20-second spot, a 30-second spot on the evening programs on the television or on the radio. And these guys, while they were talented in creating this type of music, they weren't treated with the same sort of respect that you might have from a band or um, a composer. Even though oftentimes these little jingles were extremely memorable and enjoyable to listen to, uh, that art was treated differently because it was created for a different intent, right? Um, so, how do different artists get treated for what they're creating? Um, becomes really important to pay attention to. How it's displayed, the instances in which it's displayed, whether or not it's displayed on, in an art gallery or in your home. How do we access it, right? How do we view that art and say that this is something that again I enjoy? So it's oftentimes displayed in very similar ways, and if it isn't displayed in that way, um, then we can look at it as deviant art or experienced in different ways. It can be deviant against sort of that mainstream. Um, does this hold true for all cultures? Absolutely not. Right? We have art from around the world that practices different expressions, and so yeah, this is again something that is unique to the Western world, but it has put a footprint, um, a stamp on art and all of its expression from around the world, and compares all of that art to this sort of standard, right? How does it compare to fine art? How does it compare to Western popular art, right? Does it have the sort of same longevity um, and importance that art might have originally had? So let's talk a little bit about sort of the concept of Western art. Um, it oftentimes values originality and individual creativity to be very important. That's why it emphasizes the artist itself, whether or not and so I'll give you sort of an example of how things have sort of changed a little bit over time. When we think about like American music and American pop music, um, back in the 1950s and 1960s, uh, a lot of musicians, a lot of bands were organically created, right? You guys get together in your garage and you start playing music and you start making songs and then you start playing gigs and you become popular and then all of a sudden you get offered a record deal and you've made it, right? And then something interesting happened. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Monkees, right? The Monkees was a music band of the 1960s, and they actually created a television show, and they're loosely based off of the Beatles. Um, but they had this television show, and it was really fun and very comedic, but they also had pretty good music. However, the controversy that landed the Monkees in trouble was the fact that the band itself didn't come about organically. They had been put together. Um, they had been searched out, and there were trials, and it ended up these four guys ended up forming the Monkees and then getting their television show. And a lot of people really resisted that inorganic way of creating music, because bands and musicians should come about it organically, right? Let's go to today and think about how music has changed. We have um, writers, right? Music writers who they will write a song and then they will go to different musicians and then shop those songs to those musicians, right? Taylor Swift hasn't written all of her songs. Madonna didn't write all of her songs. Um, you've got bands and musicians, groups like NSYNC and Backstreet Boys and stuff like that. They did not come together organically. They were put together. And this is sort of an interesting thing that's happening in different places. If we look at K-pop, even things like K-pop, um, Korean pop music, if you actually get to be a part of a K-pop band, you probably ended up going to school for K-pop music, and then you would have auditioned to be a part of a band, and they would put together these bands of usually young individuals, and then it became a mechanism, an industry, and in fact. South Korea has invested a massive amount of money and time into these K-pop artists and bands as a means of exporting culture. Um, because K-pop is becoming more and more popular. It's one of the reasons why a lot of K-pop artists sing both in Korean and in English in a lot of their songs. It's not necessarily um, to to sort of translate, but it's to engage different populations, right? Not only the Korean population, but the English-speaking population as well. So it can be attractive to, again, different communities. But most of those songs have been written by a specialty writer, right? Someone that does this for a living, and then those songs are performed. And this is a very common practice these days. Um, so even some of that individuality has been lost when it comes to music making. Um, and how do we view that, right? Today, that sort of concept isn't nearly as difficult to comprehend as it would have been, 60 years ago. So yeah, it oftentimes considers the originality and individual creativity to be very important. It's oftentimes prized at being unique, something special. Um, it has high standards for what is considered artistic. So having that uniqueness, having something that is special, unique to yourself, um, uh, if you can attain that high standard of uniqueness, then yeah, you can really make it. And is oftentimes seen as a superior form of art. And that's where we get into sort of understanding the importance of where societies claim art to be. Like this is really good art. This is bad art. Um, if we compare American music to like American rock and roll to German rock and roll, right? Or even country. Like that, let's talk about German country music versus American country music. There is a huge part of the population within Germany that loves the American West, and they dress up in cowboys and drive F-150s and Broncos, and eat up Americana all the time, and will sing country music in German, right? Is it as good as American country music? No, but that's because it's not American, right? So there's this idea of superiority when it comes to a specific style of music. Um, and it is oftentimes unique to that culture as to what defines what is superior or not. Our job itself is to try and understand why a culture believes a certain practice or believes a certain belief in whether or not this is better than something else, right? Again, not trying to make those determining factors of this is good or this is bad, but trying to understand why other people believe it's good or bad, right? Trying to maintain that unbiasedness. So what do we consider to be sort of the apex arts for the West? So when we think about the fine art, we're thinking about waltz and ballet. We're talking about orchestral music, choir music, five-star restaurants. Um, what makes these sort of the pinnacle of the arts? And are these the finest examples of what humans can create? And the short answer is no on that. Um, but when we think about the fine arts and when we think about um, some of these things, especially when we think about waltz and ballet and orchestral music and five-star restaurants, is they oftentimes have a sense of legacy that is attached to them, right? The waltz and ballet, it's usually from some composer that's been dead for 100 years. And that art has been perpetuated over and over and over again. It has become special to that community. So it has legacy that is attached to it. And that legacy becomes exceptionally important. When we think about restaurants, right? What is fine dining? Usually we think of sort of the pinnacle as being like French. There's something about French restaurants that um, we just go head over heels for. Um, and French chefs have so much respect around the world, and you go to France to get trained um, by a French chef, and all of a sudden you have, gravitas, and and you are something special because you were trained by one of these individuals, um, and it's because of legacy, not necessarily uh, that it's better food, but because we perceive it as being better food. So we have to take those sort of things into account when we think about, again, what we consider to be fine art, what we consider to be the pinnacle of, of an artistic style. And that brings us to how we perceive primitive art, right? I talked about primitive art earlier. Um, and again, this is sort of in that hierarchy of art that we talked about, the fine art, public art, and now primitive art. So how do we see and value primitive art, and how do we sort of distinguish it? So if we think about primitive art, certainly within the Americas, we're oftentimes thinking about Native American art. This is stuff that has been collected over time, usually by archaeologists or pot hunters or just individuals going out there, and they collect, discover, or steal sometimes this particular art, and then they place it in a different arena, right? So when we think about fine art, where does it go? It goes to like an art museum, it goes to an art gallery, some place that is designed specifically to share that art in a particular way and context. Primitive art, on the other hand, usually finds its way into like a history museum, something that represents the past, something that doesn't necessarily showcase the skill or the artistry, but sort of the primitiveness of the technique, right? And so we see it placed in natural history museums, and that primitive art then is also impacted by our perception of the people that created that art, right? Oftentimes, when we see primitive art, if we go to like the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and they've got an art exhibit up in their Native American section. And there's pottery, and then there's textiles, and there's all this stuff that was created, but it no longer has that contemporary look. It's got that primitive sense that this is a part of history, that these peoples don't exist anymore. And that becomes very problematic because a lot of the cultures that created that are still in existence, right? They are alive and living and practicing art and doing their own thing. But that perception, right, becomes really important, and how it becomes displayed, how that art is experienced, um, and how it is again consumed by the public, right? And what does that have? What kind of an impact does that have on those types of cultures? Growing up myself, um, back in the 1980s, there were people that didn't realize that Native Americans were still here in the United States. They had thought that Native American communities, um, that indigenous folk had been either killed off or had died off and their cultures were gone. And people got that impression because the only time they ever heard about these communities were in the presence of history books, right? The past, right? Not in contemporary sense, right? That these people are not continuing to live here and be a part of society and are our neighbors, but they're a part of history. And so a lot of that art, when you experience that, did not necessarily dissuade those opinions, right? They were still propagating these ideas that Native Americans weren't here, because if you go to the Museum of Nature and Science, you're seeing extinct animals, right? These animals were here, dinosaurs. We don't have any dinosaurs anymore, unless you want to call a chicken a dinosaur, which, yes, kind of it is, right? A whole other discussion. Um, but we see extinct species. That's what museums are for. That's what those nature and science museums were designed for, was to exhibit um, the odd or the abnormal, the things that are no longer available. And when you have sections that are about native or indigenous populations in those museums, you're oftentimes saying the same thing, right? And people will get that perception that these cultures are no longer in existence. And to a certain degree, that is true, because a lot of the pottery and textiles and stuff that can be found in those museums are from extinct cultures that have died off or been killed off. But that doesn't do any good for the communities that are still alive and still very much a part of our community, but they're just unseen. And so that becomes really important to understand how art is displayed, who created it, who is sharing it, where is it being shared, what kind of a venue, and then what kind of message is that sending to the general population, right? So when we think about Native American or indigenous art, um, it's oftentimes connected to history and not to modern day contemporary art. And so let's talk a little bit about anthropology and art, what we look for specifically um, as we try and understand culture. What is it that can tell us information about that community and how it is experiencing its own life. One of the things that I think is fascinating to look at is things like graffiti, right? And how graffiti has changed over the last few decades, from being art that was generally considered to be destructive and seen as gutter art, right? Terrible art. Nobody understands what it is, and it's done by uh, kids that are just out to cause havoc. And that was the perception of what graffiti was for a long time. But now we're starting to see subtle changes. We're seeing graffiti style art become marketable, right? We see products. I think a good example is things um, like Mountain Dew or Monster energy drinks, right? Where they are taking the stylings of graffiti artists and then turning them into something that is marketable. I worked with a guy a number of years ago who uh, had the opportunity. He was living in Los Angeles and was contacted by a movie production. And they needed someone to come in and draw or do some graffiti on the side of a building that they were going to be filming. So he comes in and sets up and starts doing graffiti, and the producer said, "No, no, 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 no. That's not what we want. We have certain expectations of what we want." And so he had to go with what this producer said, sort of ignoring the experience of that graffiti writer, and then uh, engaging in sort of the perceived consumption of what they actually wanted. And so it's becoming more and more commercialized. You see areas that used to be um, sort of avoided because if there was a lot of graffiti, that was a warning to people that you probably shouldn't be in this neighborhood. And that was the case for a number of decades until recently, when we start seeing communities that have a lot of street art, right? And now we're making the distinction between street art and graffiti. Uh, Same people doing it, right? But now that street art becomes attractive, and you would love to live in a neighborhood where there's artists going out and doing street art versus vandalism and graffiti. Right. So, what does that say about that community in general? Right. If you've got people moving in to experience street art, we're starting to see this process of gentrification, right? Where communities in which there might have been a lot of graffiti and a lot of street art, now you've got young, wealthy people that love art and want to experience more, and they start moving into communities that are pushing people out of those communities. So that can be an indicator of how that community is dealing with the practice of art. Um, it can indicate what state a culture is in by how it is created and displayed. Um, if we think about art in a general sense, it is oftentimes seen as seen about consumption, right? A lot of the art that we see, advertisements, the music that we listen to, oftentimes we are inundated with commercials. That is all artistic as well. It's how we present something that we want to sell or have consumed. And so doing it in a very specific artistic way, might, garner the attention of that consumer. And so a lot of our culture today is focused on that consumption of products. So everywhere you look, if you're driving in your car and you're going down the road, you're going to see billboards trying to sell you something, right? You're going to see different designs that, symbols that represent the golden arches of McDonald's. You see that and you automatically know there's, food over there, right? That sort of advertisement that is catchy enough that you will always remember what that looks like. And so, what does that tell us about today's practices? That we try and consume a lot, right? Anytime you watch YouTube, anytime you're watching television, anytime you're reading something online, there are advertisements, right, everywhere trying to get your attention to purchase this or buy that. what does that say about our society and the values that we have in that society? What if you go into a community where most of the artwork is religious in nature? Right? Well, that might tell you that the practices and the beliefs of that community are highly religious and that those are the things that are highly valued in that community. And that can tell you about how you might want to behave in that community, whether or not you're going to want to uh, maybe not uh, degrade their religion or attack it in any way because you might get a really negative response. So that might change how you approach a community and what's happening there. Um, it can also show how one culture is related to another culture. A lot of times, art can give us an insight as to the development of one community to another. If we think about American art, uh, it has been highly influenced by European, especially when we think about um, our artistic legacy, right? If we think about those apex arts, a lot of it's not American, right? It's European, it's British, it's French, it's German, and it has legacy that is attached to it, and it connects us, that Western culture, that Western ideology, which includes most of Europe. Uh, then there is this connection to the things that are old and important, right? So we can notice that we have been influenced by those cultures, um, and has had a big influence on how we have then created similar works of art that are just as impressive as the old the old masters, as it were. But then we start creating our own music, and then that gets transmitted around the world, and you see communities all around the world um, taking that art and changing it into their own. And that shows us how that information, that global presence is available, and how it's going to impact those communities, and what's going to happen in the future. When I was in Kenya, I was traveling around Mombasa, and as I was there, I saw American art everywhere, whether it was American music, um, American movies or television shows, even on the back of tuk-tuks. Right, tuk-tuks are these three-wheeled motorcycles that are, basically pedestrian cabs. On the back of these tuk-tuks, you might see like Beyonce on the back of it. Someone's, you know, sharing their love for Beyonce or Shaq, right? Uh, and so it was amazing to see this huge cultural influence in what was going on in Mombasa and in Nairobi, of this Americanism, right? Americana, that is influencing these cultures. Um, what is going to happen in the future, right? How is these different Kenyan cities going to move forward with both traditional artistry and music and stuff like that, as it's also being influenced by American music. For example, what would happen? That's just imagine one of these small communities in which, say in Kenya, and in this community they build. They're craftsmen, they're artisans, and they love creating giraffes and elephants, right? Little models and figures that are very ornate and beautiful. But Americans, we have this particular love for elephants, right? And so you get this art buyer, they go over there and they buy a whole bunch of elephants and they buy a whole bunch of giraffes, equal amounts, and they bring them over to the United States. And Americans, they really love elephants, and so they buy a lot of elephants, and they eventually buy all the giraffes too, but not nearly as quickly as the elephants. They have a demand for elephants, and so that art buyer goes back to that community and says, we need more elephants, right? And so that group of artisans, they're like, okay, well, we can make more elephants, and so they end up focusing more on making elephants and less time making giraffes. And so they start bringing over these elephants and these giraffes, and each time those elephants sell more and more, and the giraffes less and less. And the elephants begin to look more ornate. They become uh, more detailed, and the giraffes, because they're not spending nearly as much time, they don't look quite as good, quite as nice as those original giraffes did, because the focus isn't being spent on there. And now, right, we're almost exclusively consuming elephants from this community, and the giraffes are just a thing on the side, because global, uh, the global desire, that American desire for elephants, changed that community, changed what they were trying to create um, for themselves, and then a market was made, and boom, now you've got all these elephants that are coming over, but just through that idea of production, of commerce, changed that community, that artistic community, from what it was into something very much different. Still creating, but now that creation is being drawn in a different way. Um, when we think about art, it is highly contested when viewed through the lens of globalism. This is important uh, because, again, not everyone sees art in the same way, and how it is consumed. And we're starting to see more and more contested ideas about um, art and how it is expressed, it is experienced in different countries around the world. A lot of people are focusing more on traditional practices versus sort of those American practices that have been pushed out through that hegemonic force. Art through Western culture can also be seen as having a hierarchy, right? We've been talking about that hierarchy. Again, those fine arts, those public arts, and then the primitive art. So we talked a little bit about this. We try and understand the flow of art, how it is traded, how it is consumed throughout the world. Um, and I just gave this example of uh, if we were looking at that consumption of art, right? Whether or not it's going to change um, sort of the elephant versus the giraffe, and the consuming of those products. And then we also have to consider how those products are being portrayed. So, if we're looking at this art that's coming from, let's say, Kenya, these elephants and stuff, are we seeing that as fine art? Are we seeing it as public art, or are we seeing it as primitive art? Um, a lot of times when we deal with things like animism, right, nature, um, animals and themselves, we oftentimes sort of collect that and put it into that primitive realm of artwork and how it should be experienced and consumed, versus fine art, which oftentimes focuses on people, or activities that people might be doing, philosophical ideas. Um, Even though the time and care that might go into each type of that art might be equal, the perception of what is more valuable, right? Art, or nature versus civilization, right? And depending on that culture that you're looking at, you're going to get different responses as to what that art is going to be. Okay, we're going to pause there. Um, and we'll come back in a few minutes and then we will take on this exercise. All right, we'll see you in a few.